tutorial, I'm using just 4 colors: Scarlet Lake and Gamboge Nova by Holbein, and Burnt Sienna and Ultramarine Blue by Daniel Smith. My brush today is by Tracy Lebenson. He makes these amazing bamboo handle handmade brushes, and you can see just what a tiny point these synthetic bristles can come to. So I'm excited to use this one today. My paper is Fluid 100 140-pound cold pressed watercolor paper. It is 100% cotton, and it's on a block, which means the sides are glued down except for a small strip where you can remove the paper from the block. And I'm going to start with this sketch today. I did a couple of practice runs on this cupcake, so I'm going to refine it somewhat from my other practice runs. I'm starting with kind of a smiley shape actually for the muffin top of the cupcake, and then creating these angled lines coming down and away from the top of the cupcake. And then the bottom of the cupcake is really just running parallel to the shape of the muffin top, just slightly smaller in width. You can make this as imperfect or as perfect as you want. This is your painting after all, but just do your best to create the basic shape of a cupcake. I've included a line drawing that you can download in the description below if you're not comfortable with the sketching portion of this project. This part on the right is going to be completely white, so you don't need to mark very dark on the right side of the frosting. You do want to make sure you have a good contour for the cherry so that you know where to paint the cherry. So I'm going to just carefully sketch on this rounded cherry shape on top, and then a couple little lines suggesting the frosting just beneath the cherry. You'll notice I didn't make just a circle for the cherry. I want to show the frosting overlapping in front of the cherry a little bit. So that's going to be important if you want it to look realistic. And on the left side of the cupcake, we see some of the dimensions of the tiers of frosting. So you'll want to show some separation where the frosting is twisting and turning on the side of the cupcake. So I'm using very, very light pencil markings here. I don't want my pencil to show up too dark underneath the paint. And it's important to be able to sketch lightly so that if you make a mistake, you can erase it easily and quickly. Since the frosting is white too, we want to make sure it's not too dark, that our transparent paint will do most of the work for creating the dimension and the depth and shape within the frosting. I really enjoyed creating all these different tiers of frosting just swooping upwards, and it can be a little complicated to sketch, but just give it your best shot. And of course, every opportunity to draw is amazing practice, and it will help you become a better artist. So just embrace the challenge. So you can see we have all of these parallel curved shapes suggesting the turning and twisting frosting that's been piled on top of the cupcake. And there is our basic sketch. So once you're happy with your sketch, you can go ahead and grab your paints and let's get started. I'm going to begin with my Scarlet Lake color by Holbein, although you can use any brilliant red that you have on your palette. And I'm dipping a generous amount onto my brush and painting in almost the entire cherry. There are going to be a couple of highlights you're going to want to avoid, but for the most part on the left side of the cherry it's just completely red, so fill it in all the way with your red paint. Make your paint as pigmented and richly colored as you can. So this just means only adding enough water to get the paint flowing and moving a little bit for you so that you can easily brush it onto your paper. Don't add so much water that it's thinning the paint out and making it look transparent. Sometimes it's helpful to just use the paint to create an outline all the way around the contour of the cherry, so that's what I'm doing here. Dipping my brush in the water frequently to loosen up the paint and get it flowing again for me. Right now I'm outlining the shape of a small little circle, which is going to be a highlight. I want to make sure I'm painting carefully around that. And there's also a tiny sliver along the right side, running parallel to the outside of the cherry. These highlights are so important if you want your cherry to look scrumptious and juicy and shiny and real. You could paint the whole thing in completely red, but it just won't look as good. So definitely leave room for those highlights. And then I'm just filling all the rest in red. And you can add one more layer of paint on the left side if you want it to be just a little bit darker. The light source in this image is coming from the right and up above, So just be aware that everything on the left side of your cupcake is going to be in a shadow and just a little bit darker in value. I've rinsed the red out of my brush and now I'm dipping into my Gamboge Nova. That's this wonderful warm goldenrod color. And I'm going to be using this to paint the cupcake portion or the cake portion of our cupcake. And I have a lot of water in my brush right now. The more water you have, the easier the paint will flow across your surface, and you can just kind of push and pull it all the way across. So with that juicy amount of paint, I'm just carefully painting underneath the frosting, and then where I can paint more freely and loosely, I'm using more of the belly side of the brush to just scoop the paint around. And here on the right side, again, because the light source is coming from the right, I'm leaving a couple little highlights. This isn't necessarily something I'm seeing in my reference photo, but I want to include that just to help add that 3D dimension to our painting. And then here where there's the paper portion of the cupcake, I'm painting some of those ribs almost. Now I'm dipping into my burnt sienna. This is my Daniel Smith color. It's a reddish brown, and this is perfect for creating the shadow color on the left side of the cupcake. Now, because we're dropping that in on the wet yellow paint, you can see the paint is blending and blooming out and bleeding and spreading all on its own. This is such a beautiful effect that you can only accomplish with watercolor paint. While it's still wet, you can push and pull the paint around. You can add more color if you want it to be darker. Underneath the frosting, I'm adding more pigment so that it looks like almost a shadow that's cast by the frosting. Pushing and pulling the paint and letting it be a little bit lighter in value towards the right side. And then where the frosting is emerging from the base of the cupcake, I'm pulling a little bit of that burnt sienna up along my pencil lines. This is suggesting the reflection of that brownish color up into the white color of the frosting. And it's also my first suggestion of shadows. You don't want it to look too dark brown on the frosting. It's just a very light suggestion of shadows. While it's still wet, you can go ahead and add a shadow, especially if you want it to look like a reflected surface, maybe a glass table or something like that. So I'm taking that Daniel Smith Ultramarine, very watered down, and painting a shadow on the left side just underneath the cupcake, and I'm allowing that color to touch the burnt sienna slightly. And when the two colors meet, it creates almost this grayish tone. And then I'm dipping my brush in the water a little bit, dabbing on the towel, and then softening that edge with less paint on my brush. And you can see the paint blends into that area of water that I just put down. And it almost looks like this beautiful reflective surface on the table. For the frosting portion of the cupcake, I'm using my Daniel Smith Ultramarine. Because this is such a brilliant warm blue, you're going to want to add a little bit of water to your paint on your palette and mix it up first before you apply it to the painting. I'm starting at the top. Since the cherry has mostly dried here, I can carefully paint right up next to it without worrying about the colors bleeding and blending together. Beneath each tier of frosting, I'm creating a shadow shape and leaving a highlight on the top. Dip in the water if your paint looks too dark, but don't rinse all the paint completely out of your brush. Work slowly and carefully here, making sure that your paint doesn't overlap into the next tier of frosting since you want to leave a highlight along the top of each one. Right up next to the cherry, I'm pulling the color all the way up because the cherry is casting a shadow into the cupcake. So continue with each level of frosting here, painting that shadow shape on the left side. Feather your brush out a little bit as you come up towards the light side of the cupcake. You can even rinse your brush out a little bit so that your paint is more watered down as you approach the right side of the painting. You'll want your darkest values to be on the far left side, where the cupcake is mostly in shadow. You can see with these brushes, you can have a lot of control over your paint, and it comes to an incredibly fine point. Now I'm allowing that ultramarine color to overlap the light wash of burnt sienna that we put down in the shadow, and that's creating an even darker cast in that shadow crease. Be careful not to let your ultramarine color touch the cake color, otherwise you'll see it will change the color completely and it'll look like a murky blending. So keep your colors really pure and stay in the lines of your drawing. The only place you want those two colors to overlap is on the frosting itself, where we painted those burnt sienna creases in the frosting. So we're going to continue this pattern of painting those light blue shadows on the frosting side. And you'll notice I'm not bringing any paint at all the way up to the right side of the cupcake. In fact, if we erase those pencil marks and don't have any line at all suggesting the right side, it doesn't hurt the painting. We can still imagine with our mind's eye where the frosting ends and where the frosting begins. Sometimes a painting is better when you leave something up to the imagination. So in this case, we're going to have a completely lost edge there on the right side. I dipped into my red a tiny bit more, and I'm adding a little hint of red just to the left of the cherry, suggesting the cherry's color reflected on the white frosting. You can add a second layer of ultramarine if you want to darken any of the creases with one more layer. That's what I'm doing here now. I'm dipping back into the ultramarine and just darkening up those creases one more time. Now back to my burnt sienna. Using the burnt sienna, I'm darkening all the shadows one more time where the frosting meets the cupcake. I'm also creating more of a shadow underneath the frosting itself. If you really want to make your painting look like it's popping off the paper and so 3D that you could almost pick it up and eat it, make sure that your values are dark enough in the shadows and light enough in the highlights. The more contrast you have between light and dark, the more realistic it's going to look. So here I'm pumping up the shadows underneath the frosting using my burnt sienna, making that muffin top look just a little more toasted. Increasing the contrast along the line where the muffin top separates from the bottom. Just using more dark burnt sienna. You'll notice I'm being pretty sparing with how much water I have in my brush. I will dip my brush in the water just to get the paint flowing, but I'm not using a lot of water here. Now, using a top to bottom kind of brush stroke, I'm creating those striations where the foil cupcake would go. Up and down with my brush, leaving the yellow showing in between my burnt sienna. This doesn't have to be perfect. Just try to make sure that the lines are about equal distance apart, that you don't have any that are too wide or too skinny. I'm dipping in my ultramarine one more time, and wet, dropping that in right along the muffin top. And when you use really dark burnt sienna and ultramarine together, it creates almost a black color. I'm using that same dark mix to pump up the shadows under the frosting one more time, and then darkening the shadow side with more of a broad sweeping motion of my brush. This is still just that combination of ultramarine over the top of the burnt sienna. This extra layer of dark pigment is really helping our cupcake look super 3D. I've watered it down a little bit more as the cupcake turns towards the light. And then here on the left side, with those vertical brush strokes, once again, I'm darkening one more time. And I'm bringing those dark colors only about 1/3 of the way across. Rinsing slightly, and then darkening up the shadow with one more layer. And there is our finished cupcake. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. Check out these other real-time tutorials, and I'll see you in the next one.